The next session's theme is War, Conflict and Fiction. The panel discussion will delve into the profound role of literature in the Indian context, particularly in depicting war and conflict, with a focus on the pre-independence as well as the partition eras. I request panelist Aanchal Malhotra, who is an author and a historian, to come up on the stage. I also request our moderator Mandira Nayar, senior correspondent The Week, to come up on the stage.
I would like to sort of offer some context of how we're going to conduct conversation with Aanchal, and her book is one of the most, is incredibly stunning. It's really, at the heart of this book is all this richly detailed aspect about perfume. And in some ways, it's a book that lingers on like that. It's sort of this memory that you get caught in, and it's stunning and it's beautifully detailed. And it's set between both the world wars and, of course, partition, two world events and one event which changed the subcontinent and in some ways history. I think it's also interesting that we're talking about this book at this point of time where, the earlier session and all the other sessions that you're going to hear are really about military history and talking about bravery and battles and records and medals. Whereas Aanchal's book looks at the same event, an event which is a world event which changes, which is, where everybody in the First World War, and she looks at it through fiction, through soldiers, but through inner lives, and how these gigantic events really shape us. So I wanted to actually start off with asking you, Aanchal, you're an oral historian, and usually you've talked and passionately and documented, chronicled the partitions. So can you really talk about what got you interested in the First World War?
Yeah, of course. Can everyone hear me? Is it on? Yeah, great. So my work is predominantly on partition, and it was through, I conduct interviews with people who lived through it, and through those interviews, particularly with military men actually, did I learn about the involvement of their fathers and grandfathers in the First World War. I say fathers and grandfathers because women were not allowed to serve in the First World War, so there are no stories of that. But I remember as I was in my 20s, and I was sitting with an officer who said, my father was a doctor in the First World War in France, and I just found myself saying, your father, an Indian, was in the First World War? So I think the first thing is that not enough young people know about India's massive contribution in the First World War, nearly 1.5 million soldiers, let alone other forms of money or animals or all that India sent. I think despite there being very large memorials in this country for the First World War, I'm thinking of India Gate predominantly, no one really knows what it's for. And then, of course, we don't have any information on these soldiers until very recently. So when we learn about the wars in school, an Indian involvement does not make up our popular imagination of the event. And it seems very far removed from us. So I think one of the reasons why I got interested in it was that it was so different from the Second World War, which we know very much about. And of course, you read about what these soldiers thought and went through when they crossed oceans, often for the first time. And I became very fascinated with their inner lives. And it felt like it was something that needed to be written. They needed to be woven into a popular book that people may pick up and understand and realize that they may have this kind of military history in their family. Because again, I think because I deal so much with tangible history, oral history, I have a lot of people coming to me saying, oh, I have these medals from this, but I don't know anything about it. And it's important, the visibility is important. The understanding that we were there as well is very important. That has come quite late. Over 100 years later, that has come, and it has also not really percolated all the way down to the ground. So it was to create a form of awareness, I think.
And I think what you said about, in some ways, monuments, right, or memorials, right, and we all pass India Gate. It's really a central it's a landmark, right? But very few of us really realize what it is too, right? So in some ways, it's at the center of the city, which defines the city, yet it's erased from memory or it doesn't exist, right?
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to also talk to you really about, in some ways, Vivek, the character himself. And, you sort of draw him and he has a diary. He's also the scribe for all the regiments.
I mean, I should also say that there are very few Indian soldiers, and Scott Leader Chinna helped me tremendously in this, very few Indian soldiers that left any kind of tangible evidence about their time there because they were not literate.
Yeah.
But that does not mean they were non-literary. So they were able to narrate to scribes things to say to their families, letters to write. And of course, the few that were literate did keep journals. Like I know you are translating something in Punjabi, something has been translated from Gujarati as well. But they're very few and far between. So it becomes very important to give a voice and to acknowledge their own voices, and in a sense we have this incredible archive in front of us of the letters that they wrote, because when the Indian soldiers went to war, at the beginning at least they were writing something like 15 or 20,000 letters a week, which is just an incredibly vast number. How much did they have to write about? What were they writing about? How did they feel? What was the weather like? What did they eat? What did they think of the women they saw, the animals they saw? And I think though this is all very interesting, it does not always make up the larger military history we learn, because it's not about the battle, and it's not about who won or who lost or how many casualties. It's about things like, I missed the butter in my village, which is very tender, and it makes war very human. And my character, as you mentioned, Vivek, I'll give some context. He is just a young man from Lahore. He has no business really to sign up for the war, but as a 19-year-old, he sees it as a way to have an adventure. The army will take me, the war breaks out, and he enlists, and he thinks it's going to be this grand adventure. And he has no martial training. He doesn't come from a martial family. His family are cloth merchants. And so when he goes to Europe, he sees what war is, and he doesn't understand because he's not made for it. And of course, it was a very different kind of war. It was the first time, many of the soldiers were facing modern warfare. They had never been in these kinds of trenches before. The weather was not on their side. So Vivek, because he is an unusual soldier, he is a literate soldier, and he keeps a journal, as you mentioned. And there is a difference between the letters that the soldiers can send out to their families that are read by British officers and censored and translated, and the journals that soldiers keep for themselves, if they are able to write. And what we learn from Vivek's fictional journal is the inside world of warring, the human heart of the war, really.
So, I wanted to talk about really the fact that, you said that, the First World War in some ways was a very landmark event in India. 1.5 million Indian troops go, about 60,000 of them never really come back. If you go to Ypres, you find, you sort of drive by. I remember I went, and when you're on a train, you're sort of seeing these vast tracts of land, and you're seeing cows, and you're seeing canals, and you kind of think that here were these guys who sort of walked in and were really first cannon fodder in some ways, and they possibly felt this was home. In some ways, it was cold. They were not equipped. You write about that. Some of them have only Vaseline, and that's how they see. I wanted to ask you, how do you think and how do you account for the fact that when we look at it, and there hasn't been enough written about the First World War through Indian eyes, through Indian history or through military, but how do you account for it, the lump as you said, the fact that it's, and there is still memory of Lam in Punjab. It still survives. It's sort of, I don't know whether it's DNA, it's, I mean, it's sort of possibly, there is a term for it, right? It's traumatic, this, you know, we've cellular memory. Somehow we've sort of kept, muscle memory, how we've sort of kept it up. How do you account for the fact that in some ways you find that memory hidden, really, in stories, and it exists in our lives, right? Every family at that point, I mean, lots of families had that memory. They do remember it, but they don't connect it to what really they read or their surroundings. And how do you account for that as an oral historian?
I think the easiest way is how it is taught to us in school, because how do we meet history for the first time? We meet it in our textbooks, and the manner in which it is taught is not an alive history. We are taught history in a static way, which makes us feel like it cannot touch us anymore. So we're not encouraged to go home and say, oh, what about this First World War? I live in Punjab. Did anyone from my family participate in the war? Were they sent? And then, of course, maybe the best way to look at it is in this novel, Vivek goes to war. He comes back from war and he refuses to speak about what he has seen. In fact, he refuses to speak at all, which should tell you that the consequences, emotional, physical, mental, go way, way deeper than how we feel and how much we can put into language. He comes back, he doesn't talk, and really the first time his experiences of war are known to his family is after he has died. I'm sorry, I'm giving so much away of the novel, but he dies and then posthumously, through his journals, talks to his nephew about the war. And his nephew, like many of us, don't know anything about it. He's born and raised in Lahore, where so many, I mean, Punjab was like the largest recruitment ground for soldiers during the war, and yet we know so little about these soldiers. So he learns about these very intimate experiences of going to another land and fighting in a war that's not your own, through the words of his ancestor, which in some ways is very lucky because most of us don't have that. But I think it's very hard to put together a life belatedly, particularly a life that is so fraught with conflict and wars and large international world events, when you're really trying to understand what the person felt, what they ate, how did they cope with the cold, what did they feel when they saw their first snowfall. You know, these are all things that Indian soldiers had to do for the first time, and we see pictures of them, we see photographs of them playing football and them making music and speaking to French children, and of course writing these incredible letters and playing music and cooking and trying to create some normalcy in war, which is an absolutely abnormal concept, you know.
So I want, you know, there is this part in your book, and I think that's a very poignant as well as, this is where, Vivek writes to his father, and he says, it's his last letter, where he says that, we were here, right? We're all going to basically be mowed down, and this is my thing of being remembered. And I think that that's one of the hardest, it's one of the most heartbreaking things when you go, because you find that there were so many who died, and there's no memory of their name. They don't exist. You can't remember if you don't have any memory, right? If you can't invoke their name, then they're lost forever, right? They don't even exist in our memory. And you have this wonderful point where you say that if there is no memory, I'm reading from my phone, if there is no memory, then who are we at all, right? And could I ask you to please read?
Yeah, I'll read a little bit.
Yeah.
I do want to acknowledge that so much of fiction is actually constructed with research from nonfiction. So I could not have written this book without the military historians that do the work that they do and allow me to use their research material, like you and many, many others. So, and I also think fiction is the greatest ground for storytelling, because it allows you to sit in the character many characters in fact, and experience things you may never, fortunately, experience. So this is a little bit about Vivek as he's experiencing the war. It is towards the end of 1914, so he's already been there 4 or 5 months in Flanders. And I will read a short passage. The weather became colder, the battles intensified, and Vivek's entries became sparser and stranger. Sometimes he would write about the fat rats and wet sandbags in the trenches. Other times he'd fixate on the gorgeous tendrils of smoke emitted from a hookah in the Indian camp. Notes on nursing wounds would be followed by a page on the foul taste of stale bread. A scene of a cavalryman brushing his horse, the redness of a tobacco-chewing sepoy's teeth, a low-hanging cloud, the isolation of sentry duty, the taste of vilayati milk. Within these entries were moments so lucid that Samir could furnish an entire landscape of war as if the world had been engraved onto his very brain. But there were other things that remained mere whispers, mentioned as fleetingly as a ray of passing sunlight. Vivek continued to write for his fellow sepoys, admitting that many, including him, were still unclear for the reasons of this war. Their correspondence home passed through the British censors and was sometimes withheld, leading many men to omit things they could not openly write about. But in addressing letters and postcards to places he had never seen or even heard of before, Vivek realized the scale of their service. The Hindustani sepoy was spread like grains of sand across the world, from East Africa to Mesopotamia and across France and Belgium on the Western Front, where throughout the winter, Vivek spent weeks in and out of poorly constructed trenches, braving the weather and constant enemy shelling. His words no longer bore excitement or even fear, but were imbued instead with desperation and defeat. And then he writes, because he writes in his journal, he writes on a fictional journal, of course. He writes on 5th December 1914, some Sipahis went around collecting the coats of the dead, their weapons and other stray items. In all of these months, these are the first Germans that I have seen dead. But I did not collect anything, for I have already surpassed the threshold of my barbarity. The weather is cold and the wind is high. War continues day and night. No matter how much I write in this journal, it falls short of reality. This land which we once considered a paradise, now seems worse than any hell. We are not allowed to light a candle or match, let alone a fire to warm ourselves. There are many who will not survive the night. Then 3 days later, on 18 December, he writes, we have given up our lives for a mere 11 rupees a month. No man will return to Hindustan in one piece. If not a physical wound, then an emotional wound we are all sure to carry. Perhaps Baba was right, for this is no place for the son of a cloth merchant.
That's beautiful. Now I wanted to read, I know, and I think it's, and that's what I'm saying, you've talked about, you said that, you couldn't have written this without the works of military historians that were, were generously gave you this, lent you, whose books you consulted. I wanted, so there is, of course, David Omaisi's books, which are the letters that the Indian soldiers wrote back home, right? And I wanted to ask you, if you look at it in terms of military history, this, the story, the construction of the First World War and how we look at it with the battles as we're dissing, and whether it is, forget how we look at it in India and whether we can reconstruct how Indian soldiers and their contribution to these battles. But also in the West, military history is written for, in some ways, well, festivals like this where other military men or the military really basically learns stories of valor so that they can also be inspired by, right? So essentially, in some ways, it is an audience of, it is for a certain audience. It's also for people who are interested in in the stories of valor. But books like this then sort of are written by military historians but fall out of the ambit of military history, right? My question really, before I read the UMSC part, is that, do you think you chose to look at at the First World War and the story that you constructed through fiction, because it was easier for you to fill in the gaps in some ways and create this? I mean, in the sense that because in some ways the stories survive.
Well, I mean, it was harder to do it in fiction because I'm a historian.
Yeah, exactly.
But what does fiction do? Fiction shows you that the already existing world is malleable enough, particularly historical fiction. The world is malleable enough for you to open it up, create an opening, a crevice, insert fictional characters into it, and watch whether they get absorbed into the landscape or not. I mean, this book could have been 4 different books of history if you look at the different aspects that it caters to. But in fact, in my opinion, if I were to write one book, it could have only been a novel, because only fiction would allow my soldier protagonist to leave the war, become a perfumer, to come back to Lahore, to allow himself that sensory landscape to remember and forget what he had done or what had been done to him by history. So there was no question that this was going to be a novel. But in terms of what kind of sources you use to create a fictional landscape, there are different sources. Because I am an oral historian, I consider these letters a form of orality. There is a direct relationship that I have, even though it is a complicated source, because it is something that was written by someone else, dictated to another person in a language that they spoke, then withheld by the censor, translated to English, maybe redacted in some places, and then kept as an archive. In that sense, it's quite barbaric, actually. It's not unusual to the Indian army. Of course, it was done throughout the Commonwealth, but it is quite cruel. And yet, this is the only reason we know what they were saying. Not the words that they were saying, but the gist of what they're saying and what they felt. The other major source that I used was regimental journals that tell you, you know, in this case, it follows loosely the 57th Wild Rifles Journal, which tells you we went here and this is what happened, these many men died, this is what we ate, this is where we bathed, which is just routine almost. And there is a marked difference between the books that military historians write, the journals that the regiment keeps, and the letters that the soldiers write home. And only together can they make a kind of complete source for you as a novelist to use to your advantage to tell the best kind of story. You know, I am not a military historian. I'm not trained like that. So I think even the way I look at military archive is helmed by feeling, which is different than how a soldier or someone trained in that field would look at it. So what David Omesey, of course, has a great collection of the letters, but in the British Library there are even more.
Letters,
And going through them, touching them, even though they are simply typed, there is a real palpable sense of being closer to the soldier and closer. And because you speak perhaps some of the languages that they would have spoken, you find yourself translating the letter in your head to say, is this what he could have said? And there is such a poetics to the Indian lingua francas that falls flat in English in a way that you then use English to try to recreate in your novel because you think and dream and write in English. So you're always in some way translating the text. You're translating not just the feeling, not the language, but going beyond and perhaps the intertextuality between your thoughts and this text and what eventually finds itself on the page is more interesting. Is more interesting, it's more intimate, even though this archive is over 100 years old.
But so my question really was that, I mean, for example, the reason in some ways, and you said that, you know, you're an oral historian, right? In some ways, the ability to sort of...
Why write fiction?
No, I mean, I'm saying that
other people have written way better books in non-fiction than I ever could have.
My point is that I think that in some ways, and I'm going back to the same thing that you said, where you say that and if you read the letters, you do have that where you know, for example, in one bit where when they're talking about, you know, a letter which talks about Bhado and this thing where they talk about a certain season, or where they talk about where, or they, they talk about, where certain words which would be common in Punjabi or in Urdu, where you do feel the, where there is a certain, where the imagery is actually informed by the language rather than just by the words, and you sort of feel that missing. And my question, and the reason I was asking you was that in some ways, if you are a historian, and of course it's where facts are immutable, where dates are important, where cities are important, but in stories and as an oral historian, you're sort of interpreting the same event through refracted through somebody, through a person, right? Yeah. So therefore, you have it softens, or you're sort of taking in the person's memory, which is always subjective. Sorry, and I think that in some ways my question is, was it easier as an oral historian to be able to slip into these gaps and sort of understand and touch that paper and feel the palpable pain of ex-soldier and sort of make Vivek in some ways a universal mirror for everybody? Was it easier as an oral historian, where it might have been tougher for somebody who just does military history?
I don't know. I think that's a complex question. It wasn't easy for me. Because stories of the army are not, they are presented sometimes as this happened, but they are far more complicated and often contradictory. And what you do on the battlefield is very different than how you feel later about it. And I'm speaking particularly now, having interviewed soldiers that fought in 47, 48 against men who became Pakistani vis-a-vis many years ago, when they would have fought them during the war alongside on the same battlefield, on the
against
same team, so to speak.
enemy.
I don't know. It's complicated. I don't know how to answer that question. I think it was maybe easier to build Vivek's character because I was looking at him as someone who didn't belong there. And so it's easy to question what you're doing here if the character itself is questioning, what am I doing here, and this is not how I expected it to be. Maybe that was easier. And you can feel a lot of your anxiety and fear and cowardice to do with war in that character. Which eventually he deserts the war, which is quite uncommon for World War I, but he does desert the war through a very gruesome way. And maybe that's what I would have done. I don't know. It's easier to put your fear into a character who's already fearful, I think.
Also, in a place where fear is not allowed, in the sense that in history you don't record that.
Right. And Vivek is constantly talking about his comrades as people who come from these martial families who are proud to be there, and they will be proud to die on that battlefield as well, whereas he is finding ways to never go out on that battlefield. And so there is a scene where all of these men have died and there's blood everywhere, and Vivek is walking through the bodies and he says, I don't even remember what the color of the soil was before it became the color of blood.
So I just wanted to read a little bit out from a letter.
Book,
because I think that it's just sort of to give you an idea of how she interpreted it and how it actually exists through various layers of translation and redactation and sort of taking away the essence in some ways. So this is a South Indian Muslim to a friend in India, a hospital ship. It's 9th February 1915. The war is a calamity on 3 worlds and has caused me to cross the seas and live here. The cold is so great that it cannot be described. Snow falls day and night and covers the ground to the depth of 2 feet. We have not seen the sun for 4 months. Thus we are sacrificed. I neither sleep by day nor ease by night. I neither sleep by night nor ease by day. In the world there could have never been such a war before, nor will there be again. It's sad that God, that has so much power and who sent the flood, should have brought such a day to pass. Okay. So I just wanted to sort of read out. So
that's a really direct
reference.
Because at the beginning of the book, Vivek writes a letter to his father where he says, here we are starved and sacrificed. and I don't know how much longer I will live for.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you that, while this book, in this book there are 2 wars, right? You talk about the second, but it's only briefly met. This thing through the eyes.
It's the war on the home front.
Yeah. But it's through Vivek's eyes. And I wanted to, in the sense, but there's also the central aspect of your research, the partition, right? Which is very much, in some ways, a feeling that you've inherited in a way. You sort of grappling your own family's history to sort of find, answers through others, or sort of record the loss through others. And I wanted to ask you why, in some ways, when you look at, you sort of, the way that you've looked at partition is sort of almost clinical, in the sense you talk about feeling rather than the conflict, which sort of falls in the First World War, where there is a lot of the action on the ground, right? And of course, apart from this one scene where Samir loses his house, where you see where that's the only violent scene, right? It sort of is. Its violence is absent in a way.
Partition in this novel?
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you why that is, and how could you contrast? Can you sort of talk about why something that you've done so much research for, it sort of comes in through, and you talk about the loss reflected through the characters, right? But the conflict in this way, in fiction.
I mean, there's a lot that leads up to partition and independence, and there's a lot that happens after. But the moment of partition, the moment of actual loss, yes, is very brief. Because I think most people inherently understand what that's about. They can envision it. If you say someone's house has burned down, someone's mohalla has burned down during partition, you know what that looked like. And we have only seen images of violence to do with partition. Partition in this book is not clinical. It is just, it is long-lasting.
Yeah.
Partition is not static. The event is not simply someone's house breaking down or burning down and them migrating across a border. Partition is a sense of feeling that Samir carries in himself no matter where he goes, because he has been thrust out of his home. There is no need for me to drill in to an already intelligent reader that look what happened. I think I did it because we already know what the violence of partition looks like. We can imagine it. If I tell you a partition train, you know what that looks like. There have to be other ways to look at partition. There has to be other avenues to enter into an event that has already been vilified as being the most violent thing there ever was. I think that we enter partition through loss and longing and kind of confusion. There is no need for me to paint more pictures of violence, of partition. We all know what that looks like. So yes, it is the actual act of fleeing from one's home is very brief in this book. I think people expected it to be far more prolonged, but that's okay by me. It's
I was just sort of asking you in terms of
because it's my subject. That's why.
I was asking you because if you look at it in terms of conflict, right? And if you look at if the landscape of fiction is being used to talk about conflict, the subject that you had done a lot of research for finds it sort of is reflected through feeling and family. Whereas, as the World War I, which is something which you chose to use that.
Yeah, that was also the reason that I have already written 2 books on partition, and it's something that, like, partition at the back of my fingertips, I know it. I can paint an entirely vivid image for you, but it's not necessary. What was necessary was to give space to other events that have not been given space in fiction. The only other novel in fiction about the First World War in India is 1921, Mulk Raj Anand, Across the Black Water. God, it's been a while. So we deserve, I'm not saying that this is the other big novel. Navtej's novel also touches on World War I. I'm saying that it's necessary to give space in imagination to events that have shaped our space on the world stage, and how much of sacrifice we made in someone else's war. I think partition is something we are well versed with in India.
But do you think this was, in some ways, also someone else's war? In some ways,
Partition?
No, I'm talking about First World War. I mean, it was under a different flag, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We fought
but,
for
no,
someone
but I'm
else.
saying, but in some ways, there was also it was also politically. This thing. So Gandhi sort of says, go out there, fight this war, right? And I think the loss of, I mean, essentially, the Indian contribution was also because they believed if they fought this war, it would change their lives politically, right?
Sure, and what they got when they came back was Jallianwala Bagh.
Jallianwala Bagh. Yeah.
I mean, so that's why I said at the beginning, the context of why the First and Second World War were fought was very different, as were the consequences of being out in the world and fighting for someone else, what you hoped you would gain and what you actually gained. And whether that led to satisfaction or dissatisfaction is what we saw in the coming years.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, so I think now we have to open up for questions. There is one right here.
It's not a good thing when Peter Stanley tries to ask you a question about his subject.
I think you'll find it is a good thing. Hello, Aanchal, thank you very much for talking about a book that I haven't read, but I'd like to. You talked about the ignorance of your readership who don't know much about India in the Great War, but your task is to inform the reader of the context of Vivek's experience. So my question is that as a writer of historical fiction, did you have a technique or a method to convey the historical background, the historical context, in order to understand the character's experience? How did you go about it? I mean, it's almost a technical question because it's about your technique as a writer. How did you go about doing that?
About the First World War, you mean?
Specifically about the First World War.
It comes out in the tension between him and his family because he refuses to join the family business and instead signs up to be a part of the army, which is something his family doesn't understand. And then there is context where the war erupts and his regiment, specifically the Lahore Division, is sent to France via Egypt. And the tension between the family dynamics, the fact that his father doesn't speak to him, the fact that they are learning about it through the radio and the newspaper, builds the context before he goes. And then while he is there, because soldiers can send things home, he sends newspapers through packet post. And at some point, I'm giving a lot of the plot away, but at some point, when there is no news from Vivek because his letters are not reaching home for a certain amount of time, his family does think he has died, and then they are sort of obsessively looking for news in the home front. So what they cannot find from outside, they find, in local papers. There's a lot written about the war in Urdu and Punjabi papers, and that's how they find out. But the context for why he goes there and what he is doing there, while it is still unclear to people at home what this war is built through the family dynamics and the knowledge of other people around them.
Thank you. So you had a device, the device of newspaper stories and things. Not radio, of course, because it hadn't been invented then.
Right.
But newspaper stories.
The Second World War features very prominently on the radio.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's how they learn about, of course, they listen on the radio.
So that, you answer my question perfectly because you've used, in fact, an historical source to convey historical understanding.
But I think this is also part of the problem with a historian writing historical novels, that you care so much about these details that no one else does. Like, I don't think anyone else has ever asked me this question, but I was so concerned that everything on every page must be historically accurate.
Thank you.
Thanks for the nice discussion by both of you. And I have not gone through the book, but it was good to learn that there is one more book is added on World War I and World War II regarding the fictions or the non-fictions. Earlier I knew that Across the Black Sea by Mulk Razan, and then one is by Raghu on World War II, Farthest Field. So I'll read the book after the discussion I heard. So I have one quest, and that you named the character as Vivek. So I have read some of the stuff on World War I, and I have also worked on some articles on World War I. So in Punjab, the Vivek name was not that popular. So that is my one.
I know.
And other is that how your book is, what is the main focus, which is different from Mulkraj Anand.
Mulkraj Anand's book is quite different because it really focuses on what the soldiers are doing, say, on the ship or on the battlefield, and it goes into the social life and the relationship between the soldiers, how they perceive the war, how they perceive themselves, and what they are thinking of what is happening back home. My book starts with World War I, but it also covers World War II and partition. And of course, my characters are perfumers. They make ittar. So my character Vivek, yes, you're right, the name is not typical for that time. Originally he was called something else, but his full name is Vivek Nath Vij. So it has a kind of old-fashioned element to it. But yes, you're absolutely right, it's not a typical name for that time.
So it was deliberate name, thought over, or just you gave it? So
it was a name that I liked. It was a name that was in sync. If I couldn't name him what I wanted to name him, this was the next best thing. Oh, I wanted to name him after my grandfather, whose name is Vishwanath Vij, which would have been a way more sort of salt of the earth kind of. But then my grandfather said, what if people thought I was there in the war and I deserted the war? And I said, you were not old enough to be in the war. So that, anyway, he said, please don't use my name. So I changed it.
thank you.
Oh, so many things, yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of intertextuality between my non-fiction and like a lot of interviews that I did with people informed real dialogues. I remember interviewing a woman in Calcutta who was talking about the courtship she had with her husband right after she moved to Calcutta after partition. And she said, for a few months he mixed with me, as in to say we were having our courtship period. And then in this novel, Firdaus, who is the heroine of the novel with Samir, she says, for 10 years, Samir mixed with me. But this phraseology of one individual mixing into another human being can only come from someone's very specific experience, you know?
Also a certain time and a certain
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying that the book also has a lot of her own story and her own family story, and and we were talking about. You heard what she said, right? She said that it can only come from someone, who has lived through that. And I said, it's also language. People who walked across and people, I mean, for example, English for people who, between, pre-partition English and English now, it's changed. Phrases have changed.
I mean, like, Vivek's father says something in the book like there are riots going on.
Yeah.
Now riots is a very like old man Punjabi thing. My grandfather used to say riots.
Yeah, riots.
All the time.
Yeah. Or the way that you say puttar with everything that there is a certain, or anarkali, for example. I mean, I think that the mapping of this marketplace, right? The way that it is, whether it's when Nehru comes, or the way that you talk about. Even the nameplate outside, the name of their shop, right? You can almost see it, and it's written in this thing because it did come from a space and from language. It also comes from what is lost. So the idea of Lahore, and I think you've said you reconstruct it and you went there twice. And I just wanted to, I know this in the. I mean, in some ways, the idea of Lahore, or the idea, or the Lahore you inherit, okay, is different from the Lahore that exists and the Lahore that, because it was a specific time, place Lahore, right? So the loss that when you go to Pakistan or where you go, this thing is also the loss of, it's a double loss, or it's a loss felt. This because it's changed in somebody else's memory.
If you see it like that, like for me it was, of course so much is lost, but I'm there.
Yeah.
And it's in a way, not enough people have that privilege.
Yeah.
So I'm there, yes, I didn't find anything, but you're able to be there to reconstruct, to talk to people, to see what life was like before. Like at some point, you realize that actually what you're building in this book will serve as architectural memory
Yeah,
for
yeah.
the generations that come after you to
Yeah.
imagine what Lahore of their family would have been
Yeah,
like.
yeah. That's what I think that's important. But yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of going by what, in some ways, Ritu Menon said, right? Where she said that when she went to Lahore, she said that this was not my feeling, this was not me, but yet I felt this as if it was a loss for myself, right? So, sorry, any more questions before we sort of have a... You have another question? Oh, sorry.
No,
You
I'll
have both
hand it
this-
over to Peter. And I'd just like to say thank you. It's been fascinating because as historians, we collect stories, right? And to have two historians who actually convert the historical stories that we've collected into fictional stories is, it's fascinating to engage with that.
I remember, like specifically with you, coming to you at the USI and asking if you had any archive of Indian soldiers on the ship going across. And you read out something that you had translated. It was unfinished. I don't know if it's finished now or not. Still unfinished. But the fact that you were reading from a working translation of a journal that someone has kept on the ship informed all the early entries that Vivek wrote when he was going across. So it was, and of course, hearing in your voice, you read in the Punjabi, you read in the English, it meant a lot to me.
I hope I'm not monopolizing, but I'm fascinated by this question. There was reference to the fact that military history, especially in India, extols glories and confirms tradition and is very positive. And your story involves a man who deserts. Can I ask you, have you had any reaction with Indian readers who somehow feel you've let the side down by having a character who reneges on his military responsibilities? What sort of sensitivities has that aroused?
Not one. Not one. I don't think people realize that deserting wasn't as common. And there are really, like, you can pinpoint the number of deserters in the First World War and you know where they went and what side they went to and what they did and when they came back and why they did it. I don't think enough people know about that archive, know about that history. Like I'm saying, I don't think enough general readers understand the landscape of the First World War enough to question, because it is unusual.
Could it also mean that perhaps military historians aren't as celebratory as you might assume?
No, I don't think, we have this festival. I don't think that's it at all. I think it garners just a specific kind of readership. That's it. I don't think that's the same readership as this.
Yes, that's a good point.
You know, also,
Yes.
I mean, the title, the cover.
Yeah.
The person that reads your work may not pick this up except if
Yes.
it was me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's all I think. But when I discussed the desertion with people that worked, say, at the National Army Museum, they were very surprised because they were like, no, it's not possible. And also, how will he desert? There are very few, like, in fact, there's mention of how he deserts in one of the letters. And it was George that said, well, he can desert like this, or he can desert like that, or he can desert like this, but it's going to be painful for him. You know, so, but I don't think anyone is reading this as carefully as you may. And the notes I may receive after.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. That was a lovely conversation.